Well, hello. There's Rocky. He's sleeping there. I don't know what you can see. I'll move the phone around a bit. There he is, anyway, if you can see him. Um, he was having a rest there. I'm going to tell you a story tonight about my dad and a job he had back in the 1950s. There was a company called Frost and Woods, which was a local company. It's long gone now. But they started out making farm implements in the 1800s, plows and things like that. And then later on, they got into making appliances, refrigerators and stoves and freezers and other things like that. Anyway, in the 1950s, for a little while, my dad drove a truck delivering appliances to people who had bought them from Frost and Woods, from the factory. And so he had to go all over the place in the area anyway, delivering different things that people had purchased. And of course, in the 1950s, a lot of people were getting these things for the first time. They were getting electricity in their homes and they were buying electric ranges and refrigerators, all kinds of stuff. And also, bear in mind, in the 1950s, appliances, it didn't matter what it was, they were heavy. And my dad and another guy that worked with him would have to load and unload these things and everything and get them into people's houses. And they had very little in the way of mechanical help to do it. It was all basically with your arms and your back, and your feet, basically, to move stuff. Anyway, my dad and his helper, one time they go out to this place way in the back country, and they were delivering a deep freezer. These people had bought a deep freezer and it had to be delivered out there, so my dad and his helper, they loaded it onto the truck at the factory and they drove it out there way up into the back country. And when they got there, of course, they unloaded it and brought it into the house. There were live chickens in the house. There were actually live chickens in the kitchen. And anyway, the lady of the house told my dad and his helper where to put it. And so they put it in the location where she said to put it. And now my dad is standing there with the power cord in his hand, with the line cord in his hand. And he says to the woman, "Where would you like me to plug this in?" And she gives him a blank look. She says, "What do you mean?" And he says, "Well, where's the nearest electrical outlet?" And she says, 5 miles down the road at the neighbor's place. Turns out they didn't have electricity. They weren't aware when they bought it that it needed electricity to work. So my dad and his helper had to take it back anyway. They had to get it out of the house, load it into the truck, and take it back. And of course, the people would get a refund then for the money they paid for it. But that's just kind of a thing that, we don't really think much now about that. But in those days, it was all so new, that stuff. And it's kind of neat to think that people were that innocent, and that people, obviously whoever sold it to them, that the subject of electricity to run it never came up. Maybe the salesman assumed that they knew it needed electricity, and maybe they thought that it worked in some other way. Maybe they thought you'd have to put a block of ice in it or something like an ice box. I really don't know, but anyway, it was of no use to them as it was, so it had to go back. Just kind of a neat story anyway of a bygone era. Another story from a few years later, in the early 1960s, my dad delivered newspapers for the Ottawa Journal. There was a newspaper in Ottawa called the Ottawa Journal, and it went out of business in 1979 or 1980. I remember the Ottawa Journal when I was a kid. Lots of people around here used to get the Ottawa Journal. Anyway, in the early 60s, my dad had a paper run where he delivered the papers from the Ottawa Journal to the different, little grocery stores and places like that where they were sold. So he'd be out early in the morning, and my dad, he was kind of a wild driver. He liked to drive fast, my dad did. And he had a 1956 GMC half-ton truck at the time. It was actually the only, I think it was just about the only vehicle he ever bought brand new. He bought it new in 1956. Anyway, my dad, there was one time he was just booting her along down the highway, and they come over the crest of a hill, and there were a bunch of cows had gotten out onto the road from a farm. And my dad, he couldn't get stopped in time, and he ended up plowing through the herd of cows, and he killed at least one of them. I don't know if he killed more than one or not, but I know he killed one for certain, at least, maybe more. And it didn't do any harm to the truck at all, though, but he did kill a cow, and I don't know how that worked, if because the cows weren't supposed to be on the road, so I don't know if my dad compensated the farmer for the loss or not. I never did hear that part of the story, whether he had to or whether he did or whatever, but that's just another story anyway about my dad going way back. Yeah, anyway, my dad passed away at 51 years of age when I was 20 in 1988. So he's been gone a while anyway, but those are just a couple stories about him. Anyway, I'll talk to you all later. I hope you're having a good night. It'll soon be bedtime for myself and Rocky. And I'll send out a video when I give Rocky his treats, which will happen in a little while. In the meantime, have a good night. Talk later.